Hello, and welcome to FACTS webinar, Silvopasture for Poultry. Our guest presenter is, and for our first webinar of the 2024-2025 season is Austin Unruh. I'm Samantha Gasson, FACTS Humane Farming Program Director, and I will be moderating this session. Thank you for joining us. Before we dive right in, let me take a minute or two to do a few quick introductions. Food Animal Concerns Trust, or FACT, is a national nonprofit organization that works to ensure that all food-producing animals are raised in a humane and healthy manner. We accomplish this by supporting humane farmers through our humane farming program, promoting policies that make foods from animals safe and healthy to eat through our Safe and Healthy Foods program, and generally help consumers make informed food choices. You can visit our website at foodanimalconcerns.org to learn more about all our farmer services. And I know a lot of people are interested in this. Our Fund a Farmer grant season is going to be starting in just a couple of weeks. At this time, I'm very pleased to introduce our esteemed presenter, Austin Unruh. Austin is the founder and CEO of Trees For Graziers, a company helping farmers in Pennsylvania and beyond take their grazing to new heights using silvopasture. It's his goal to make silvopasture as easy and cost-effective as possible for farmers, which is why Trees For Graziers offers everything from planning and funding acquisition to planting and aftercare, while also growing silvo-specific nursery stock. We're not thinking about silvopasture. That's what I feel about cows. I'm always thinking about cows. Austin's favorite activity is picking all manner of tree crops with his young family. So we are incredibly lucky to have Trees For Graziers back with us today to share their experience and their expertise. You can find their last webinar, which was Silvopasture on a Shoestring, by searching on our website. And I will also put a link in the chat. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to you, Austin. Austin, please take it away.
Perfect. Thank you, Samantha. So I run Trees For Grazers. I started Trees For Grazers, and we are based in southeastern Pennsylvania. We're about an hour west of Philadelphia, if that gives people an idea where we're at. We're in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. So a lot of dairies, a lot of Amish producers in our area that we serve. So let's see here. Let's see if this progresses. There we go. So our goal really is to make it as easy as possible for people to integrate trees into their pastures. And we do this by providing all of the services that people need in order to get trees established. We recognize that most farmers are way too busy as it is and don't have the time or the money or the energy to invest in something that they know is not going to provide them hardly anything for, in most cases, 5 years or more down the line. It's valuable. Everyone recognizes, I think, the value of shade and animal welfare, in particular in this audience. Everyone recognizes the value of animal welfare. But trees are not something that are going to provide you an instant return on investment, right? So that's why we try to make it as simple as possible for folks to be able to continue running their farm as they are. And then also we come in and work with them to plant trees to get those established in their pastures. And then we also do trainings. We train other people on how to do this, to take the what we've figured out, what we've developed, and apply this to their own area, whether they're working for a nonprofit or they're working on their own farm, or they want to work with other farmers in their area. That's really what we have a passion for, is we want to see other small businesses and services being able to start all around the country so that they can help farmers in their area to get started with silvopasture. Because we found that it's not like there was a whole bunch of people clamoring for silvopasture before we got started, but in the last number of years, we've been able to grow our business to now where we're at the point where we have 8 people on our team, and we have worked with over 40 farms in the area, and we've really only gone an hour, sometimes up to 2 hours outside of our little area. So there's a lot of interest and a lot of opportunities for silvopasture. And we have a lot of resources available for free at treesforgrazers.com. So let's start off with, what is silvopasture to begin with? And really, it's very simple. It's the integration of forages, livestock, and trees. And those 3 ingredients can be mixed in any number of millions of different combinations, really dependent on your farm context, your goals, what you want to achieve, what kind of livestock you're working with. So we want to take those three elements and combine them in a way that fits for your farm and your goals. Generally, there's two ways to get silvopasture. One is you can take an existing woods and you can thin it, or you can take an existing open pasture and plant trees into it to create a silvopasture. Our focus tends to be on taking an existing open pasture and planting trees. We don't have a lot of overgrown woodlots in our area. Our land goes for $30,000 an acre at the minimum. If you can find land for less in our county, good luck. So we don't have a lot of land that just grows up and is not utilized for crops or grazing already. So most of our clients are coming to us with an existing open pasture where we're planting trees into that pasture. Probably the most well-known version of silvopasture is the Spanish dehesa. This covers literally millions of acres between Spain and Portugal, and there's two main oak trees. So it's primarily oak and then pasture, and they have cork oaks, and then they also have this what's called the holm oak, which produces a really large acorn, and they run cattle and sheep and goats, but then famously also they run Iberian hogs under this Dehesa agroforestry system, with the goal of then creating a very high quality, high value product in the end, which is Iberian ham, which sells for $100 a pound. So the Dehesa of Spain is probably the most well-known silvopasture system out there. But today we're going to be focusing in on silvopasture for poultry, which is something that I'm pretty excited about right now. I haven't really had the opportunity to speak much about this. Most of our work to date has been with cattle, almost exclusively. Most of the farms around us are dairies. We also have been working with some beef operations. We have some that are doing some poultry, but really not much. However, there is a lot of upside to poultry and then hogs silvopasture. I'm going to mention hogs here and there throughout this presentation, just because they're very similar in their diets. So most of the livestock that we have worked with to date are ruminants, so cattle primarily. We've done a little tiny bit with sheep, and maybe one or two sites where there's some goats integrated into the farm, but really mostly cattle. Now, monogastrics, your poultry and your pigs, are going to be one, they really like the shade, right? They like the shade, they like shelter, they like, especially chickens, they love having this feeling of protection, this feeling of being sheltered and being protected from predators. So it just makes sense. If you're going to have those out on pasture, it makes sense to have trees and shrubs for those livestock. Or return on investment, as it were, from your silvopasture system, as with chickens and with pigs. Samantha, is my presentation still coming through well? My computer told me that my internet connection is unstable.
So what I'm seeing is poultry, and it's got jungle birds, give shelter, and perennial feed. Is that where? And it's got some blackberries. Is that where you wanted to be?
Perfect. Yep. And my audio is still coming through well.
It is. You
And a lot of thumbs up. So that's great.
Yeah.
Okay.
You froze for a second, but you're okay now.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure. So there's a lot of upside to integrating trees for poultry and for pigs, in that we can really reduce the cost of feeding those, right? Because with ruminants, you let them out on pasture and they're able to get all of the forages that they need, and you can finish them on pasture. With poultry and with pigs, the forages can be a supplement, but it's almost never the entire diet for those livestock, and the bulk of the diet is going to come from grains, right? And grains are expensive, and it's one of the main things that's holding the pastured poultry and pastured pigs back from being a larger force or being adopted by more people is that it is really expensive to feed these livestock. So what I really want to see is I want to see us make progress in feeding poultry and pigs on pasture. And today we're going to be more focused on the poultry side of things, but a lot of it just applies to pigs as well. So one very important thing that I think everyone here understands is that our domestic chicken is not a domesticated prairie chicken, right? These are jungle fowl is where they come from. They're built for the jungle. That's where they want to be. That's where they feel the most safe, the most at home. They are not meant for the open prairie. They're not meant for open pastures. So just fundamentally what we want to do is we want to recreate the ecological systems that these birds are adapted and evolved to thrive in. So and we can start with just providing shade and shelter. Someone who has worked on this is named Leonie Jacobs. She's at Virginia Tech. She's studied the effect of having shade and shelter for poultry. And there's some very simple things like she's found that they do. Well, I think that's the next slide. The chickens have range, like they range more. They feel more comfortable, so they go further from their coop. They have fewer foot issues. Their manure spreads out. And we know that chickens, anyone who's had chickens, knows that they like to be in shelter, right? They want to have protection from aerial predators. They don't want to be out in the sunshine when it's really hot outside. And they want to be able to express their natural instincts by pecking and foraging, and going after bugs and all kinds of stuff. So this is just a picture from one of the sites that we've done. We've really only done one poultry specific silvopasture project. That was like 4 years ago. So it's been quite a while. And we really haven't had the opportunity to do more of these projects just because we don't have a ton of farms in our area that are doing this. But you can see that where are the chickens? They're underneath the trees. And this was on a cloudy day. I think it even rained a little bit. So it wasn't even a sunny, hot day. But the chickens are still underneath the trees. That's where they want to be. It's where they get their cover. Here on this picture, you can see where the chickens are all the time, and they're right underneath those trees. Now, this isn't necessarily what we want to see on all of our sites, right? Because we don't want to see that much traffic underneath a few small trees. But I will note that these were the trees that were closest to the barn, and the barn had several hundred chickens. So they didn't all look like this, but these were the trees that were closest to the barn, and they were getting the most traffic underneath of them. But it just goes to show that the chickens really did appreciate these trees, and having them for shade and for shelter. So integrating trees for shade is simple, and I think it just makes sense. But now, if we're going to plant trees for shade and shelter, let's also think about what other benefits we can get from those trees and shrubs. And here we get to the point where you have to think about: do I want trees that are going to provide food for me or for human consumption in general, or do I want to plant trees that are going to provide feed for my livestock? The simplest thing to do in every case is planting trees that are going to be there for direct livestock consumption, because then you don't have to worry about harvesting, processing, or marketing. You don't have to come up with a new market for hazelnuts or elderberry syrup or whatever it is. If you're already raising poultry, you just raise more poultry, or you continue to raise poultry, but you're able to see your feed bills go down. Like, that's really our goal: is let's continue to raise poultry, but let's do so with a lower overhead. Let's do so with less costs of production, and ideally be able to earn more money because of a high quality product. So if you're going to be growing a crop in a poultry silvopasture, hazelnuts and elderberries are two that are quite interesting. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about a farm that's been doing this in just a little bit. So some of the tree species that make sense for poultry in silvopasture. Mulberry really is the number one. It's really hard to compete with mulberry for poultry silvopasture and also for pigs, just because it's such a great tree for these. It has the fruit is pretty high in protein. It's a we'll get into that a little bit later. The fruit is great. The leaves are great. They're also great in protein. It grows fast. It drops, and this is important. It drops in an early part of the season when most other things are not dropping. So in our area, I usually think of June 1st as the beginning of mulberry season. And then if you have everbearing cultivars, they can drop all the way into August. Um, so it's at least a 1 month period where you get a heavy drop, and then you can get more drop over a course of up to 3 months is typically what we think about. So it's a long drop period, and there's really not many other things that are dropping fruit during that time period, during the early summer. Now, when you're in September, October, right now, there's just tons of things that are dropping fruit. So you have a lot more selection then. But in order to spread our season out, we really want something that's going to drop early as well and during the summer. And mulberry is really the number one there. They're cheap. They're easy to work with. They're easy to grow. They put out a lot of feed, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. Persimmon is another one, and that's going to be more of a starting in August, as early as August, but then going really late into the season. It can drop as late as into January, February, depending on the cultivar. So you have a lot of opportunities with persimmons then to choose what drop window you want to hit. And then there's others, like there's a whole bunch of others, and really there's gonna be a lot to learn and figure out over time. One is gumi. So gumi is it's if you research gumi berries, um, it's another one that drops in like June and July. It's related to autumn olives, um, and it has a larger fruit than autumn olive. Very high in nutrients, also high in fats, good in protein. Autumn olive. Now, I know I'm going to make some enemies with this, but autumn olive is pretty darn fantastic when it comes to a fruit, a tree crop that's useful for chickens. This is a picture that I took just the other day. I have autumn olive cultivars, and I also have like a dozen chickens, and the chickens go crazy about this stuff. They eat it.
Looks like we lost
In
you.
quantity, and that's one of the things to reduce your. Samantha, can you hear me?
We can now. We lost you for just a second.
Okay. Did I, where did I break off?
Um, oh yeah, so somebody actually suggested if you might want to turn your video off because that will help.
Okay, let me do that.
Yeah. You were just saying that you just taken this picture and that you've got a few chickens and they absolutely love it.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so they absolutely love autumn olives. And I wouldn't suggest planting autumn olives in an area where they do not naturally or where they do not already occur, because they can definitely be invasive for sure. Um, But if you're in an area where autumn olives naturally occur already, and there's a whole bunch of them, they're really, really nice for chickens. They consume them in large quantities. So elderberry is another one that chickens can consume, for example, but they do so very sparingly. Like they don't consume it in quantities. I have elderberry bushes right next to my chickens. I've taken a whole bunch of elderberry fruit, thrown them over to the chickens, and they've eaten just a couple of them, and they mostly just leave them go because they're too potent, and they don't want to eat them in that form. Whereas autumn olive is one that I can throw over, and they just consume it in really large quantities. Mulberry is going to be similar. I don't have as much experience feeding persimmon to them, but I would imagine that they should eat them in pretty large quantities. And then we can get into some more. There's Coosa dogwood, which I'm very curious about because it also drops right about now. It's easy to grow. My main question there is, are they going to consume it in quantities? There's chinkapins, so that's a small chestnut. With poultry, we get into the problem of we need it to be small enough for them to consume. Like a turkey is going to be able to consume more than a chicken would. Hogs, they can consume just about anything. So we want to think about something that is small enough for them to consume. Willow oak is an interesting one. I don't know if it will ever be something that we do at scale, but it has these really small acorns and they're like bright orange on the inside, which is kind of cool. And dwarf chinkapin oak also has small acorns. So so I would like to have a diversity of tree species in there, but really when we get to it, like it'll come down to a few species, with mulberry being a pretty much a go-to, that are going to provide the bulk of the feed for poultry. Now, if stuff drops and you get worms or you get whatever laying its eggs in there, that's a bonus. Like that's really a bonus in these kind of systems, because that's a high protein, high fat feed for the chickens. So if people typically worry about wormy fruit, that's not at all a concern. In fact, I would love if we could have something that drops and it's absolutely full of worms and the chickens can come and eat that up and get the extra nutritional benefit from that. So we only have so much time, but I would really, really highly recommend the book Tree Crops by J. Russell Smith. It was written back in the 1920s. This guy traveled all around the country and all around the world looking at how different people use tree crops. And he looked at, he has a whole chapter on mulberries. The book is also free. It's available as a free PDF online. He looks at mulberries in particular and the numbers that he shares from, and these are anecdotal, so take it with a grain of salt. But he finds that here's the most interesting thing to me, is that all throughout the southern states, mulberries are commonly used as feed for pigs and poultry. In North and South Carolina and Georgia, nearly every pig lot is planted with these trees, and the mulberries form a very important addition to the pig's diet. I think that's the main takeaway to me, is that back in the 1920s and even before that, folks were planting mulberry trees into their pastures for pigs and for poultry. Now, they didn't have cost share. They didn't have higher prices for mulberry finished pork. They were just doing this because this was economical for them, right? So I think with the conditions that we have today, we have good cost share programs for planting trees into pastures. There's extra margins to be had by having something that no one else has, and having livestock out on pasture. And we'll be able to have really specific genetics of trees that we'll be able to access that are silvopasture specific. All those things mean that it should make all the more sense for folks to plant trees in their pastures for pigs and poultry and for their feed. So I just want to go over this really quick, is that this summer I sent in mulberry fruit for feed analysis, and I couldn't find hardly anyone who had done it. I did a pretty extensive online search, wrote an article about that, which you can find at treesforgrazers.com. And I'm working on an updated article, but the long and the short of it is the fruits themselves are quite high in protein. So I tested two different cultivars. One came back with 12% protein in the fruit, and the other one came back with 18% protein in the fruit. Pretty significant. We also had an amino acid analysis done. They came out similar to corn. And then the two cultivars, the one had 11% fat and the other one had 20% fat, again, in the fruit. And then they had plenty of energy. So very significant and quite well balanced sources of feed, more balanced than you would expect, and more balanced than most other fruits and almost any other fruit is going to be. Most fruits are going to have much less protein and much less fat. So that's a real benefit to mulberries. And where they were low in protein on or low in amino acids, their leaves tended to be quite high. So the leaves are well known as being very high in protein and very digestible. And so they're widely used across the world for livestock feed. So I just wanted to put that out there, as mulberry trees are very interesting as a pretty complete diet for poultry. So this is just a picture again of a site that we did. We haven't done all that many, but this is one of the sites that we did, and this is, I believe, 3 years after planting. So in an ideal system, we would plant trees and shrubs that are already above browse height, so that we don't have to worry about chickens accessing and getting over doing more damage than they should to the trees while they're trying to get established. One thing that I really like about the idea of planting trees into pastures with chickens is that it's going to be a whole lot easier than planting trees into pastures with cattle, which is our current bread and butter. Like, if we can get trees established in pastures with cattle, chickens are not going to be any problem at all. But you still need to think about the protection methods and the best ways to do so economically. In most cases, I think if the chickens aren't a super high pressure, if there isn't like a large chicken barn, and then you have thousands of chickens coming out into a pretty small area, then I'd say a 2-foot shelter is likely all that you need. And then typically what we do when we plant trees is we mulch around the base of every tree, but that is going to be challenging when you have poultry in the system that want to come through and scratch. So we need to think about potentially alternative ways of conserving moisture and reducing weed competition at the base of the trees. Then layout. So here are some considerations, and I can't tell folks like here's the ideal layout, because we just don't have enough experience in this to be able to make those kind of recommendations. But here are some things that you want to consider, is that if you want your birds to be able to have access to consume this fruit, and for it to reduce your feed costs, then your birds need to have access to it, right? So that can get a little bit tricky in rotational grazing, and in the way that you do your poultry rotations. So it also makes a difference in the kind of shelter that you would need in order to accommodate this. So if you were to have just a standard chicken tractor and they only have access to the space right underneath them, well, they might be able to get access to a couple of fruits at a time, but that's really not going to make a difference. So they really would need to have access to a larger space to be able to roam and get access to those fruits and make use of them. During the season that fruits are dropping, you probably want to be back every couple of days in order to get those fruits before they disintegrate, right? So if a mulberry drops on day 1 and you're not back for a week, that mulberry is gone, right? That mulberry has disintegrated, it's been eaten by bugs. So you want to be able to come back within every couple of days in order to make the most use of what's dropping there in the pasture. So in a system where you have a stationary barn, and then you have a large pasture out there, it's very easy to plant trees in there, right? And for the chickens to make use of them, because they have access to that whole space all the time, or most all the time. Now, it's going to be easy, but it's not necessarily going to be maximized, because your chickens might have to walk several hundred feet in order to get to a tree that's dropping on the far side, and they might not actually want to do that. And so if you can create a system where you have mobile coops that you can bring them closer to the trees that are dropping at any given time, that's in a way that we might be able to maximize the use of these tree crops. But it's going to take a little bit more creativity in order to do that. So I say this with the idea of, we're going to need a lot of creativity and a lot of just experimentation, and then sharing with one another of what do we find, what works well in this context, what works well in another context. As the years go by, I'm excited to see what people learn in this space. There's also seasonal considerations. So beyond layout considerations, we want to think about how we engage with this seasonally. As you might imagine, this is best thought of as a seasonal thing, where we don't have tree crops dropping in February, other than maybe a couple persimmons, but that's probably not going to be worth it, right? So we probably aren't going to think about producing silvopasture raised poultry in the winter. We want to think about our summer, so probably May through October, maybe November, and maybe in November we're finishing turkeys on silvopasture. So generally we have mulberries in June in our area. If you're further south, we might be talking about in May. And then gumi is another one that also drops during that time period. And then in September, October is when we get a second flush of different tree crops, whether that's persimmons, Coosa dogwoods, which are pictured here. By the way, Coosa dogwoods are mostly like you'll find them in landscaping. We have them all around in developments and whatnot. All kinds of different things that drop in the fall. And it's important to think of things that drop because there are plenty of tree crops that hang on the tree. And those just are not all that useful in this case because we need them to drop to the ground for them to be useful in a poultry silvopasture system. Okay. So there's a couple examples of folks that are doing this already. There's not that many out there, but there are a few who are pioneering this. So one is Tree Range, and they focus on meat birds. So they're a cooperative in Minnesota, and they're focused on meat birds. I love the name Tree Range. I think once they were working with another name there for a while, and they were brainstorming names. And when they came to Tree Range, they were like, "Yep, that's exactly what we should name it." And it just makes sense. So I should say that they focus their trees, and in fact, it's more shrubs. So they use mostly hazelnuts and elderberries in their systems. And those are specifically not for the birds. They might get a little bit of elderberries here and there. But those are really as a secondary income stream on that same piece of land. And so what you see here, these are hazelnut shrubs that they're working with. And they do a great job of providing shelter, of providing shade, and then they provide a secondary income stream for the farmers growing those. Now you get a little bit more challenges of you need to then harvest those and process them and market them. And it might not make sense economically to process them on a very small scale. And that's one of the benefits of a co-op is they have a co-op for the birds, and then they can also like stack a co-op for the tree crops, like the elderberries, and turn them into elderberry syrup, and the hazelnuts and turn them into whatever products that they're going to be making out of the hazelnuts. I also think it's very important, like they have this system pretty well down, and they will train people on this. So they feed their birds outside, and I don't remember right now if they water their birds outside, but they do bring their feed outside. And so that way they're not just inside, and every once in a while they'll go outside in order to stretch their legs, but they have to go outside in order to get their feed. So that's a valuable thing. A lot of folks who give a whole bunch of pasture to birds, they feed inside, and then the birds don't ever end up going outside. There's also the Lakes Free Range Egg Company, and that's based in the United Kingdom. And interestingly, I believe that they are requiring now that folks who join that company and grow for them, that they are planting trees in their pastures. They're focused on native species, so not trees that are going to drop food for humans or for their livestock, but really just planting trees for shade and shelter and for native ecosystem services. And the owner of this company has said that their return on investment is strong. It just makes financial sense for them to plant trees in their pastures, even beyond the ecological value that it's providing. It's providing real economic value just because of higher quality of the birds, or higher animal welfare and higher health of the birds, and as a result, higher quality of the eggs. So fewer seconds, less breakage for the eggs. And so their farms they're able to experience a pretty good return on investment of planting trees just because they're getting better animal welfare. And I'm running out of time here. So there's all kinds of other things that you can do in a poultry silvopasture system. You can think about planting hybrid poplars for very fast shade. If you really just want shade and shelter, hybrid poplars are a great way to go. Osage orange is a tree crop that I'm really interested in for producing like super long lasting fence posts, and they're also going to suck up a lot of nitrogen. Um, you do want to think about not planting nitrogen fixing species, because for the most part, you're going to have plenty of fertility in these systems as it is. So like a black locust, maybe not the best option because there's already a lot of nitrogen there. You also want to avoid species that cannot take a lot of fertility. So apples are one kind of classic species that does not want a lot of fertility. If it gets a lot of fertility, it gets into pest and disease issues. Um, Consider, if you're going to have poultry year round, consider windbreaks and hedges that provide that thick cover and that wind, that ability to block the wind. And then if you want to integrate trees that are there for biodiversity, oaks are the number one for biodiversity. And then basswoods, catalpa, tulip poplar, all kinds of different species. If you want biodiversity, a whole bunch of options just open up. So some challenges here is this is very new. There's just a lot to learn about this. Hardly anyone is doing this, and the people who have not been doing it for super long. So it's really an old practice that we're bringing back, and we've lost a lot of the experience and the wisdom in the intervening generations since we were doing this consistently. We want to also think about how to balance the access. Like the birds need to have access to the fruit, but we also need to be able to provide adequate protection for those birds, right? And that can be easier said than done. And then also, how do we integrate these with ruminants? How do we integrate ruminants into this system so that we can use them on broader acreage? And of course, one of the problems with one of the challenges of silvopasture is that delayed return on investment of it's several years before you get any kind of return on that investment in the tree crops. But what I really think is an opportunity here is we have an opportunity to create an unfair advantage for pastured poultry producers. So this picture is an example of what we don't want, right? This picture is an example of what we want to create an alternative for. But really, pastured poultry producers, for the most part, they don't have many economic legs up compared to confinement producers, because they're probably feeding as much or more feed as confinement operations. So what I want to do is, can we create poultry silvopasture systems where the pasture producer is actually paying less, so they're not having to buy as much feed because the feed is dropping for free from the trees. And also, can we create a product that is very different, where we have mulberry finished broilers, or we have persimmon finished turkeys, and we have those tree crops are yielding a different quality to the meat, to the product that we're offering. And then just planting trees into pastures and having them actually used is great PR. It really helps tell a story to consumers of this is a product that is substantially, significantly different than what you're going to get anywhere else. So really what we want is, we want to reduce our feed costs. We want to reduce our cost of feeding and growing our product. And we want to be able to sell it for at a higher dollar point, because this is something that is substantially different from anything else that people can get access to. And I want to see this applied at scale. So that's the vision right there. I want to see this applied at scale. I want to see pastured poultry producers being able to do this at scale and really compete and outcompete folks who are doing this in a CAFO model. We can get into funding. I should wrap up here and give time for the Q&A. There are opportunities for funding. Oh, and I believe that this slideshow will be available afterwards. I have a link available that Samantha has. I will just tell people, start small, start now, and get some experience with planting trees into pastures, and specifically planting trees for poultry. Let's not plant 100 acres all at once, but let's start now and make some quick, small, quick experiments that we can then learn from, and then go from there. And if folks want to see more, so this is the same site that you saw earlier in some pictures, just a couple years earlier. If you were to go onto YouTube and you type this in, Silvopasture series episode 5, it's in the series of I believe it's called Farming with Trees. It's a great series. check all of the videos out. But this will give you some visuals on that silvopasture system that we developed for poultry in that case. So with that, I think I want to wrap up, and we'll head on over into the Q&A session.
All right. And while everybody is formulating their questions, I will go ahead and do our end of webinar poll. Did that show up for you guys? Relaunch. It did not show up for you. Okay. There you go. Is it showing up now?
There we go.
Perfect. Okay. All right. So if you guys want to just go ahead, we'll let Austin have a little bit of a water break. And if you would like to put your questions into the Q&A, again, that's the 2 speech bubbles in your toolbar. And yeah, we'll just get started with the first question. So Christina asks, can silvopasture be a food and feed option? And what does that mean for poultry hog management and production of people food? I think you probably have answered that for the most part.
I would just say that you can definitely do both. I would just say that there are food safety regulations that come in when it's a human food. So you need to be extra thoughtful and do your diligence and do some research into the Food Safety Modernization Act and the regulations that go along with that.
Yeah, and I had a question about layers and making sure, because one of the things with layers is you need to make sure they're getting all the requirements that they need, or else your egg production is going to go down. Have you found any problems with that with layers in silvopasture? If
I can't say we have enough experience in it in order to tell. I would say that you probably, until people find out otherwise, you probably want to give them free access to whatever they need, right? Free access to their regular feed and free access to their the tree crops, and they will supplement on their own. But if you only give them half of their ration, you're probably asking for problems, right?
Yeah, Emily actually has a question I think it's on a lot of people's minds. What about predators perching in the trees? Is there a goal to have dense enough trees, shrubs to provide adequate protection? And another thought I'd had is, do you just try and plant things that maybe have bendier limbs that hawks don't want to land on?
So again, we're talking some hypotheticals here because we don't have the length of the duration of experience. From my conversations with folks who have planted trees in the pastures for chickens, or they happen to be running poultry in a silvopasture setting, folks have told me very clearly that having trees in those pastures has reduced the amount of aerial predation. That just having trees in there providing a canopy has reduced aerial predation for their birds. Now, are there going to be examples where that's not the case? Probably, especially if you have snags or if you have trees with like limbs that are sticking out that are really easy to come and perch on. Shrubs are probably going to be the ones where they provide the most protection, right? But with layers, you want to be thoughtful that you're not creating spaces where they're going to create nests inside of those really, really dense shrub systems. So those are some of the factors that we want to be thoughtful about. But from what I've heard from actual producers talking about this, it seems that the trees are a net positive in terms of providing more protection rather than a net negative.
All right, there's quite a bit of stuff going on in the chat, including some resources, which I will make sure I send out with our follow-up email. And then also, might want to consider adding in a guardian dog in there if you're going to go, that way. Yep. Okay, so the next question is, how do you combat invasive tendencies of mulberry and autumn olives?
So yeah, those are they're going to be a little bit different in the way that they pop up in pastures and whatnot. So mulberries are going to tend to come up along your fence lines. They're going to tend to come up where birds have a chance to perch. Mulberries seem to come up, or autumn olives tend to come up more randomly, it seems. So I'd say autumn olive is probably going to be the more invasive of the two. Again, I would not plant autumn olives in an area where there's not already existing populations. But yeah, so that's kind of the main thing, is don't introduce them into a new area. And I would say, like, on the autumn olives, like, start very, very, very small, very conservatively on that. If you do want to do autumn olives, that's one that, like, I don't even feel all that comfortable integrating them into someone else's. I'm right now just playing around with it on my own scale because I want to test it out first before I recommend it anywhere else. And
Mhm.
mulberry is one that mulberry's been around for forever, and like, it was planted in huge quantities back in the 1600s, 1700s for silk production, actually. So I'm not too concerned about adding more invasive species when we're talking about mulberries. Yeah, it's already out there.
All right, thank you. Anne, who is actually with NCAT, and she's put some really good information in the chat. She says she's in California, and so she thinks the species are different there because it's more arid. This is more of a comment than a question. And so if you would like to comment on the comment, please feel free. Elderberries would still be good, probably mulberries too, likely with some irrigation. I'm guessing the persimmons you mentioned would be the ones native to North America, which do not grow in the West.
Yeah, but in the West, you would, especially California, if you're in like zone 7 or 8 or warmer, you should be able to grow the Asian persimmons quite well. And then mulberries, yeah, mulberries are going to grow just about anywhere. They're pretty much.
Yeah, they sound like bamboo. I'm not really very familiar with them. So, and also had another question about the tree range system,
Mhm.
especially with the startup costs to join the co-op and the profitability. You mentioned the ROI, return on investment, for the lakes free range. Do you know about how farmers are doing economically with the tree range?
Um, so with the tree range system, I don't know that. That's a great question. I wondered the same myself. I know that there's, like, in their system, their model has like a barn on a, I think it's on a cement pad. And then they have, I think their units are like 1.5 acres, which is divided in half into two 3/4 acre sections. I think that's the basics of one of their modular units. And to me, like, the biggest cost is building the barn, right? So I really don't know how long it takes for them to repay that upfront investment. Um, and I think it's great for people to be thinking of maybe some lower cost options, or some options that are more portable. But I really can't speak to that a whole lot.
All right. Cherry, I would like to know, do chickens and pigs eat the Osage, or is it Osage apples? Osage apples? I'm not familiar with them.
There's probably not many things that eat Osage orange, Osage apples, hedge apples, Bodark. However, there's like a million names for that one. Um, Chickens actually probably do the hedge apple. We'll just call it that. It's mostly like, if there's not a whole lot of substance to it, like, it'll break down and turn into goo. But then it has these seeds in them, and the seeds are pretty high in oil, in fat. So they would probably eat the seeds. I don't think that they would really get much out of the rest of the fruit. And the seeds are probably not in high enough quantity to be worthwhile to plant for them. So mostly when I'm thinking of Osage, is I want the wood, because the wood is super hard, super long lasting, and really high BTU firewood. So it has a lot of things going for it, particularly looking for like fence posts and that kind of thing. And it can most likely, I have not tested this, but it can most likely take a lot of fertility, because it's a relative of mulberry, and mulberry can take a lot of fertility and can just keep on growing.
All right. We've got a couple of questions about predators, which I think we just sort of covered. Grant has a question about any consideration or knowledge to share regarding planting in blocks, helping to time fruit drop from moving poultry through strategic blocks.
Yeah, yep. That's how I would generally think of doing this, is rather than randomly spacing trees or putting putting trees out at random, I would want to plant certain cultivars, certain species and certain cultivars within a species together, so that we know maybe the Illinois everbearing mulberry block is going to drop over here, and once we're done with maybe the Oscar mulberry block is going to drop for 2 weeks, and then we don't have to go back to that area ever again. Like, we just move on to other areas that are dropping feed, and we know that if we spend time there, it'll be worth our time to move our poultry over there. So yes, definitely I would definitely think of it in terms of blocks that we can concentrate our efforts on for a shorter period of time.
And one of the things that's been mentioned in the chat is having a spoke and wheel kind of system where you have your barn in the center. People do that a lot with hogs. And then you could time those fruiting, what we want to call them, the fruiting opportunities as part of that spoke and wheel kind of a system.
Yep.
Somebody actually, I'm sorry, I was going to say that again.
Makes perfect sense to me. Yep.
Yeah, I think would make sense to me too. Anyway, KW mentioned that on their they have more trouble with aerial predators on their open pasture than they do in their silvopasture areas, which I thought was interesting. And yeah, so we've got a couple more questions. Valerie wanted to know, do farmers return their hens to the coop at night? I'm not sure if you know the answer to that or not.
I don't know what standard practice is. You might know better than I do. I know for my birds, they just go and they go back to the coop themselves.
Yeah, I mean, our layers get locked up at night, but our birds out on pasture do not. They stay out. They're out on pasture. So,
okay.
Sherry also had another good question about apples. So if apples don't like fertility, what other species don't like fertility? So I guess it wasn't about apples, it's about fertility.
Yeah, I'd say most of your standard fruits are probably not going to like a lot of fertility, and they're going to have more pest and disease issues when they do. And my understanding is that has to do with like the elongation of like the more energy that they're putting into new growth, the weaker that new growth is, and the more susceptible it is to pests and disease. So apples, pears, peaches, plums, I don't, with my knowledge at this point, I would not plant those in an area that's going to get a lot of chicken activity. It may be in an area that's going to get a couple chickens for a short period of time during the season. That could be interesting, but certainly not near a chicken house, right? Where you're going to get a lot of fertility right in there. That's an area that I would reserve really for mulberries, maybe Osage orange, poplars, things that can take a lot of that fertility.
Okay. KW had another question, which was, do you know of any producers who are having success accessing fundings, cost share for silvopasture through NRCS? So in Michigan, they're saying that at least their offices seem totally unprepared, even though the same practices are offered.
Yeah, I'm not surprised at all. So we have in Pennsylvania, our state NRCS does not support silvopasture. So we really have not worked with our NRCS system to get silvopasture established on farms in Pennsylvania. We've had to use other sources of funding. There are other states where there is a good bit of funding, openness for funding silvopasture. You might be interested in a poultry silvopasture system because it's a smaller scale. You might not want to use the regular the regular silvopasture practice. You might have more success with either the tree shrub establishment practice or the windbreak and shelter belt establishment practice. Both of those could very well be used for poultry, and then it's less of a challenge for an NRCS staff because they should be more familiar with those practices than they are with the silvopasture practice, which almost no staff have experience with. So that's what I would try, and I think both of those practices are on the books in almost every state. The hedgerow, the hedgerow or the windbreak practice, and then there's a tree shrub establishment practice.
All right. And we've closed out the questions. That's fantastic. You guys had some great questions. Just to let you guys know, we have quite a series coming up of webinars. And next week we have Ensoil coming and talking about their living algae. So that'll be pretty exciting.